The child appeared before the mother did. Raymond looked up from his cold coffee to find a little girl standing at his table. 6 years old, maybe less. Her copper curls caught the cafe lights, and the navy coat she wore probably cost more than his monthly rent. "My mom's sorry," she said, voice steady and practiced. "She's late." He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. She shouldn't have known which table was his, but she'd walked straight to him. No hesitation. "You're Raymond, right? The baker?" Her fingers twisted a silk handkerchief, embroidered with initials he couldn't read. "Mom said you smell like cinnamon. She said you'd wait." His throat went dry. The dating profile, marketing consultant, no children, starting fresh, had been simple, normal. Nothing about secrets wrapped in a 6-year-old's words. When the glass door opened and a woman in a black suit stepped through, moving like she owned the room, Raymond understood. He hadn't been waiting for a date. He'd been waiting for someone's carefully hidden life to arrive in 2 pieces. The woman stopped 3 feet from the table, her posture rigid, as if approaching a negotiation rather than a first date. She was younger than her profile suggested, or maybe just better preserved, with dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. The little girl ran to her, and for a brief moment, the woman's face softened in a way that made Raymond's chest ache. It reminded him of how he used to look at his own daughter before cancer took his wife and fear took over everything else. "I apologize for the confusion," the woman said, her voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone who'd trained themselves out of an accent. Isla wasn't supposed to come inside. She was meant to wait in the car. Raymond noticed she didn't sit down, didn't extend her hand, just stood there like she was ready to bolt at the first sign of judgment. "It's fine," Raymond said, surprising himself with how steady his voice came out. "I'm Raymond," though apparently Isla already knew that. He smiled at the little girl, who was now half hidden behind her mother's leg, peeking out with those dark, too knowing eyes. The woman's shoulders dropped half an inch, not relaxed exactly, but less prepared for battle. "Vivienne," she said. Not Viv, like in the messages. Vivienne, the kind of name that belonged on boardrooms and charity galas, not in his world of pre-dawn bakery shifts and flour-dusted aprons. She finally sat, pulling Isla onto the chair beside her, rather than letting her sit separately. Protective. Cautious. Raymond understood that impulse more than she probably realized. The first 15 minutes passed in the kind of stilted conversation that made Raymond wish he'd stayed home. Vivienne answered his questions with the precision of someone reading from a script. Yes, she worked in marketing. No, she hadn't been on many dates since her divorce. Yes, she enjoyed the city but sometimes missed having a yard. Every answer felt curated, stripped of anything that might reveal who she actually was. Isla, meanwhile, was far more honest. She swung her legs under the chair, studied Raymond with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. And eventually asked, "Do you have kids?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Vivienne's hand tightened on her coffee cup. Raymond saw the warning look she shot her daughter, the silent language of a parent trying to maintain control of a situation already spinning out of reach. "I have a daughter," Raymond said quietly. "Bryn. She's 8. He didn't mention that Bryn barely spoke to him anymore, that grief had built a wall between them that he didn't know how to climb, didn't mention the school counselor's concerns or the way his daughter flinched whenever he tried to hug her, like she was afraid he might disappear too. Isla nodded, processing this information with a seriousness that seemed far beyond her years. "My dad's gone too," she said, matter of fact. "He had an accident. Mom doesn't like to talk about it." Vivienne's face went white, then red. "Isla, we don't..." But the little girl wasn't finished. Mom cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping. I think she's lonely. That's why I told her to try the app thing." The confession landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward in the silence that followed. Raymond watched Vivian struggle with whether to discipline her daughter or flee the cafe entirely. He made the decision for her by saying, "My daughter hasn't seen me cry yet. I think maybe that's worse. I don't know how to show her. It's okay to be sad, without falling apart completely. It wasn't the kind of thing you said on a first date. Wasn't the kind of vulnerability that led to second dates or happy endings." But Vivian's eyes met his for the first time since she'd sat down, and something in them looked less like armor and more like recognition. They were both drowning, just in different oceans, both trying to be strong enough for children who needed them to be human instead. They talked for another hour, and somewhere in that conversation, the script fell away. Vivian told him about her late husband. Not a divorce, she finally admitted, but a car accident 2 years ago that had left her the sole heir to a real estate empire she'd never wanted. She told him about the board members who questioned every decision, the society pages that scrutinized her every move, the pressure to be the widow who grieved correctly while also being the CEO who never showed weakness. She told him about Isla's nightmares and her own insomnia, about the way their too-big house felt like a mausoleum some days. Raymond found himself talking about the bakery he'd inherited from his father, about waking at 3 in the morning to make bread because it was the only time he felt like he was doing something right. He told her about Bryn's silence, about the guilt that aided him every time he saw his daughter's face, and remembered that he hadn't been enough to make his wife want to fight harder to stay alive. "That's not how cancer works," Vivian said softly. It was past midnight now, and the cafe staff were cleaning around them with pointed patience. Isla had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder an hour ago, her silk handkerchief clutched in one small fist. "You know that, right? Whatever your wife felt about you, cancer doesn't care. It doesn't listen to love or hope or how much someone wants to live." Raymond's throat tightened. "I know that in my head. My heart's still working on believing it." Vivian reached across the table then, her fingers brushing his for just a moment before pulling back. The touch was brief, but deliberate, and Raymond felt something crack open in his chest that had been locked tight for 4 years. "Thank you," she said, "for not running when Isla told you who I really am." Raymond frowned. "A woman with a kid? That's not exactly a deal-breaker." Vivian's smile was sad. "A woman whose last name is Sterling, whose face is in the business section every other week. Most men run from that, one way or another." They exchanged numbers, real ones, not just app messages, and made plans to meet again. Something casual, Vivian suggested. Maybe the park with both kids, so Bryn and Isla could meet. Raymond agreed, even though the thought of introducing his daughter to anyone new made his stomach twist with anxiety. He walked them to Vivian's car, an understated black sedan that probably cost more than his entire yearly income, and watched as she buckled Isla into a booster seat with practiced efficiency. "She really did tell me I smelled like cinnamon," Raymond said, remembering Isla's words in the cafe. Vivian paused, her hand on the car door. "She watches you through the bakery window sometimes when I drive her to school. Your shop is on our route. She's been asking about the man who makes the bread that looks like flowers for 3 months. When I finally signed up for that app and your profile came up." She laughed, a real laugh this time, not the careful one from earlier. Isla said it was fate, that the universe was telling me to stop being scared. The second date happened 4 days later at Riverside Park, and it was a disaster in the best possible way. Bryn refused to come at first, claiming she had homework, but Raymond had gently insisted, promising they'd leave if she wanted. His daughter had agreed with the kind of resigned expression that broke his heart, like she was humoring him because she'd already lost one parent and couldn't risk losing another by saying no. Isla, meanwhile, arrived like a tiny hurricane, immediately pulling Bryn toward the playground equipment with a confidence that suggested she'd never met a stranger she couldn't befriend. Raymond watched his daughter's stiff shoulders, the way she let herself be dragged along without protest, but without enthusiasm either, and felt the familiar weight of failure settle in his gut. Vivian touched his arm. "Give them time," she said. "Isla's pushy, but she reads people better than most adults I know. If Bryn needs space, she'll figure it out." But something unexpected happened while Raymond and Vivian sat on a bench, pretending to watch the river instead of their daughters. Isla convinced Bryn to show her how to pump her legs on the swing set, and then somehow got Bryn talking about the book she was reading for school. 20 minutes in, Raymond heard something he hadn't heard in months, his daughter's laugh. It was small, almost hesitant, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to find anything funny anymore. But it was there, and Raymond had to look away so Vivian wouldn't see the tears in his eyes. She saw anyway. "It's good, isn't it?" Vivian said quietly, seeing them be kids instead of little adults carrying grief too heavy for their age. Raymond nodded, not trusting his voice. They sat in silence for a while, watching Isla teach Bryn some complicated hand-clapping game that involved a rhyme about friendship and promises. The afternoon sun made the river sparkle, and for the first time in years, Raymond let himself imagine that maybe, possibly, there was a version of the future that didn't feel like punishment. They started seeing each other regularly after that, carefully, slowly, always with the girls involved. Coffee shops and parks, children's museums, and Saturday morning bakery visits, where Isla and Bryn helped Raymond frost cupcakes in his small kitchen. Vivian never came to his apartment, and he understood why. It wasn't shame exactly, but there was a clear divide between her world and his, and crossing it required navigation neither of them had quite figured out yet. 3 weeks in, Raymond searched her name online and immediately wished he hadn't. The articles painted a picture of a woman he barely recognized, the Ice Queen CEO who'd taken over Sterling Properties and ruthlessly streamlined operations, the widow who'd inherited billions and showed no signs of remarrying, despite being one of the city's most eligible catches. There were photos of her at charity galas in gowns that probably cost more than his car, always alone, always composed, never smiling with her eyes. The comment section was brutal. People speculated about her marriage, about whether she'd loved her husband or just his money, about what kind of mother she must be if she could run a company with such cold efficiency. Raymond closed his laptop feeling sick, not because of what he'd read, but because he recognized the cruelty of people who'd never bothered to see past a carefully constructed public image. He thought about the woman who'd cried in his bakery last Tuesday, when Isla had given her a lumpy cookie she'd decorated herself, who'd admitted she had no idea how to braid hair and had been watching YouTube tutorials for months. He thought about how Vivian drove 40 minutes out of her way 3 times a week just so Isla could see Bryn at the park after school, how she'd quietly paid off the medical debt Raymond had mentioned in passing without ever bringing it up again. The woman in those articles was a stranger. The woman he was falling for was someone else entirely. But he was starting to understand the weight she carried, the performance required just to survive in a world that wanted her to be either tragic or terrible, with no space for anything in between. The first crack in their careful bubble came on a Tuesday evening when Raymond brought Bryn to Vivian's house for the first time. He'd been reluctant to accept the invitation, aware that crossing that threshold meant acknowledging the vast difference in their circumstances. But Isla had begged, and Vivian had promised it would just be dinner. Nothing fancy, just the 4 of them. The house was a 3-story Georgian in the kind of neighborhood where Raymond usually only delivered wedding cakes. Isla answered the door herself, already in pajamas, despite it being only 6 o'clock. and dragged Bryn upstairs to her room before either parent could protest. Vivienne appeared in the hallway looking uncertain, her usual confidence stripped away by the vulnerability of letting someone into the space where she actually lived. "I know it's a lot," she said, gesturing vaguely at the marble entryway and the staircase that could have been in a magazine. "It was his family's house. I keep meaning to sell it, but Isla's room is the only place she doesn't have nightmares, so I—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. "I'm sorry. You probably think I'm insane, complaining about a house like this. I think you're a person living in a space that doesn't feel like yours," Raymond said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I think you wake up every day and put on armor to face a world that wants you to be something you're not. And I think you're exhausted from pretending." Vivienne stared at him for a long moment, and then something in her face crumpled. Not tears exactly, but a breaking of the facade that she must have been holding together with pure will. She led him to the kitchen, a massive space with commercial-grade appliances that looked barely used, and admitted she'd ordered takeout because she had no idea how to cook for more than 2 people. They ate Thai food straight from the containers while the girls played upstairs, and Vivienne told him things she'd apparently never told anyone about the prenuptial agreement her husband had insisted on that made her look like a gold digger to his family, about the board members who still treated her like she was playing dress-up in a dead man's chair, about the exhaustion of being photographed every time she left the house, of every relationship being scrutinized and judged. "Do they know about me?" Raymond asked. He'd been wondering when this conversation would come up. Vivienne set down her fork, her expression careful. "Some photographers caught us at the park last week. Nothing's been published yet, but my publicist called to warn me it's coming. They're going to paint you as—" She stopped, clearly struggling with how to phrase it. "They're going to make it look like I'm slumming, like this is some kind of rebellion or phase. They'll dig into your life, your finances, your wife's death. They'll turn something good into something ugly, just because that's what sells papers." Raymond felt cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. He thought about Bryn, about photographers outside his bakery, about the kind of attention that could shred whatever fragile healing his daughter had started to do. "Maybe we should stop," he said quietly, "for the girl's sake, before this gets complicated." Vivienne's eyes flashed with something that looked like pain and anger mixed together. "It's already complicated. It's been complicated since Isla walked into that cafe. The question is whether we're brave enough to keep going anyway." They didn't stop. Instead, they tried to be more careful, meeting at Raymond's bakery before dawn, or at Vivienne's house after dark, always with the girls as buffers and excuses. But careful only worked until it didn't. The photos hit the gossip sites on a Friday morning. Raymond and Vivienne at the park, her hand on his shoulder, both of them laughing at something Isla had said. The headline read, "Sterling Heiress's New Fling, From Boardroom to Bread Boy." The article was vicious in its superficiality, painting Raymond as an opportunist and Vivienne as a woman having some kind of grief-induced breakdown. They dug up his late wife's medical records somehow, speculated about his debts, even quoted unnamed sources, saying he'd been struggling to keep his bakery afloat. None of it was technically untrue, but all of it was cruel in its framing. By noon, photographers were camped outside his shop. By 3, his phone was ringing with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. By 5, his landlord had called to discuss concerns from other tenants about the disruption. Raymond picked up Bryn from school to find her in tears, surrounded by classmates who'd seen their parents reading the articles. Someone's mother had apparently made a comment about those people who take advantage of rich widows, not realizing Bryn was standing right there. His daughter had locked herself in a bathroom stall and refused to come out until the counselor called him. On the drive home, Bryn was silent for 10 blocks before finally saying, "Are you dating her because she's rich?" Her voice was small, uncertain, in a way that made Raymond want to drive his car straight into the photographer still trailing them. "I'm dating her because she makes me laugh," Raymond said, gripping the steering wheel too tight. "Because she understands what it's like to lose someone and have to keep going anyway. Because she's kind to you, and she doesn't pretend that everything is fine when it isn't." Bryn was quiet for another moment. "Kids at school said you're going to leave me like Mom did, that you're going to move into her big house and forget about me." Raymond pulled the car over so abruptly that the photographer behind them nearly rear-ended him. He turned to face his daughter fully, seeing the terror in her eyes that he'd been too caught up in his own problems to notice building. "Bryn, look at me. I am never leaving you. Never. Your mom didn't leave you either. Cancer took her from us, and that's not the same thing. I know these past 4 years have been awful, and I know I haven't always known what to say or how to help you feel better. But you are the most important person in my entire life, and no amount of money or houses or anything else could ever change that." Bryn's face crumpled, and then she was crying in a way she hadn't since the funeral, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and painful. Raymond unbuckled her seatbelt and pulled her across the console into his arms, holding her while she soaked his shirt with tears and snot and 4 years of unexpressed grief. Behind them, a camera flashed through the window, capturing the moment for tomorrow's gossip sites. Raymond didn't care. His daughter was finally crying, finally letting him in, and the rest of the world could burn for all he cared in that moment. He called Vivian that night, after Bryn had finally cried herself to sleep. "I can't do this to her," he said without preamble. "The photographers, the articles, the kids at school. She's 8 years old, and she's terrified I'm going to abandon her. I can't add this kind of stress to her life. Not now. Maybe not ever." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Vivian finally spoke, her voice sounded hollow. "I understand. I've been selfish, thinking we could somehow make this work. Isla's younger. She doesn't understand what the articles mean yet. But Bryn..." She stopped, and Raymond heard something that might have been a suppressed sob. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For not warning you how bad it would get. For dragging you into my mess of a life. You and Bryn deserve better than this circus." Raymond closed his eyes, leaning against the wall of his kitchen. "That's not what I'm saying. I don't want to stop seeing you. I just don't know how to protect her from all of this." Another silence. "There might be a way," Vivian said slowly. "But you'd hate it, and I'm not even sure I should suggest it." She told him about the Sterling Properties Gala happening in 2 weeks, a massive fundraiser that every society reporter in the city would attend. "If we go public on our terms, control the narrative before someone else does, it might take some of the sensationalism out of it. I'd introduce you as my partner, we'd do 1 interview with a reputable outlet, and then hopefully the gossip sites would move on to the next scandal." Raymond listened, his stomach churning. "You want me to put on a tux and pretend I belong at a $1,000 a plate fundraiser?" Vivian's laugh was bitter. "I want you to stand beside me in front of the people who think I'm either a cold-hearted executive or a tragic widow incapable of moving on, and show them that I'm actually just a person who met someone kind in a coffee shop. But yes, it would involve a tux, and photographers, and probably some extremely uncomfortable conversations with people who have opinions about appropriate mourning periods and social hierarchies." Raymond thought about Bryn's tear-stained face, about the photographers who would keep circling if he didn't find a way to make the story boring. What do I have to do? The next 2 weeks were a crash course in a world Raymond had never wanted to enter. Vivian's publicist coached him on how to deflect invasive questions and smile for cameras without looking too eager or too reluctant. Her stylist took him to get fitted for a tuxedo that cost more than his monthly rent, then told him he'd look charmingly out of place in a good way. Vivian herself grew increasingly tense as the gala approached, her texts becoming shorter and more perfunctory. Raymond understood she was retreating into the armor she needed to face her world, but it still stung watching her become more Widow Sterling and less just Vivian with every passing day. 3 nights before the gala, she showed up at his bakery at 2 a.m, when she knew he'd be there, kneading dough for the morning rush. She looked exhausted, her hair down for once, wearing jeans and a sweater that made her look younger and more uncertain. "I can't ask you to do this," she said without preamble. "It's not fair." "You didn't sign up for any of this." Raymond wiped flour off his hands and came around the counter. "Neither did you. Neither of us signed up to be widowed in our 30s with young daughters to raise alone. Neither of us asked for photographers and gossip sites and people judging every decision we make. But here we are, and I'd rather face it with you than hide from it alone." Vivian's eyes filled with tears she wouldn't let fall. "The board is threatening to call for a vote of no confidence. They're saying I'm unstable, making poor personal decisions that reflect badly on the company. If we go to this gala together and it goes badly, I could lose everything my husband built, everything I've been trying to preserve for Isla's future." Raymond took her hand. This woman who carried the weight of an empire on her shoulders and still found time to pack Isla's lunch with notes shaped like hearts. "Then we make sure it doesn't go badly. We go there, we smile for the cameras, we show them you're a human being allowed to have a life. And if they still vote you out afterward, then maybe that company isn't worth keeping." Vivian finally let the tears fall. "I'm so tired of being strong all the time," she whispered. "I'm so tired of pretending everything is under control when I feel like I'm drowning." Raymond pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since they'd met, she let herself break down completely. They stood in his bakery kitchen while the dough rose and the city slept, and Raymond held her while she cried 4 years of grief and pressure and loneliness into his flour-dusted shirt. The night of the gala arrived with all the inevitability of a storm. Raymond picked up Vivian and Isla from their house. Bryn was staying with his sister for the night, a decision that had involved many tears and promises, and tried not to let his nervousness show. Vivian looked stunning and untouchable in a midnight blue gown, her hair swept up in a style that emphasized the sharp lines of her face. Isla, dressed in a miniature version of her mother's elegance, studied Raymond with serious eyes. "You look fancy," she pronounced, "but you should smile more. You look like you're going to throw up." Raymond laughed despite himself. "I feel like I'm going to throw up," Isla nodded sagely. "Mom throws up before all the big meetings. She says it's okay to be scared as long as you do the scary thing anyway." Raymond met Vivian's eyes over her daughter's head, saw the mix of vulnerability and determination there, and felt something settle in his chest. They could do this. They had to. The ballroom was everything Raymond had dreaded: crystal chandeliers and designer gowns, waiters circulating with champagne that probably cost more per glass than he charged for a wedding cake. The moment they walked in together, conversation didn't stop exactly, but it definitely shifted. Raymond felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing him, calculating his net worth, his background, his worthiness to stand beside Vivian Sterling. She must have felt it too, because her hand tightened on his arm for just a moment before she lifted her chin and led him into the crowd. The next hour was a blur of introductions and careful small talk. Board members whose names Raymond forgot immediately. Society matrons who looked at him like he was an interesting specimen in a zoo. Business partners who asked pointed questions about his bakery that felt more like interrogations than polite interest. Through it all, Vivian stood beside him with the grace of someone who'd been performing for crowds her entire life, deflecting the rudest comments and smoothly steering conversations away from dangerous territory. It was going better than Raymond had expected until Vivian's father-in-law appeared. Charles Sterling was in his 70s, silver-haired and imposing, with the kind of presence that made rooms go quiet. He looked at Raymond with undisguised contempt, then turned to Vivian. "A word, please. In private." It wasn't a request. Vivian's spine went rigid. "Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of Raymond." Charles's smile was thin and cold. "Very well. I've called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. We'll be voting on your future with the company. This," he gestured dismissively at Raymond, "is exactly the kind of poor judgment we've been concerned about. My son built an empire, and you're throwing it away to play house with a baker." The words were designed to cut, and they did. Raymond felt heat rise in his face, shame and anger mixing together. But before he could respond, Vivian stepped forward, and something had shifted in her expression. The careful mask had fallen away, replaced by something Raymond had never seen before: pure, controlled fury. "Your son," Vivian said, her voice carrying despite its quietness, "built an empire on my ideas. For 8 years, I was the one who found the properties, structured the deals, and managed the relationships that made Sterling Properties what it is today. I did it while your son took credit, and you patted him on the back for being such a savvy businessman. I did it while pregnant, while nursing, while raising our daughter, mostly alone, because he was too busy enjoying his success to be a father. And I've done it for the 2 years since the accident, growing the company's value by 40%, while grieving and parenting and trying to hold myself together for everyone who needs me to be perfect." She paused, and Raymond saw tears in her eyes that she refused to let fall. "I have given everything to this company, everything. And I'm done apologizing for having the audacity to also want a life, to want someone who sees me as a person instead of a widow or a CEO or a cautionary tale. So yes, call your meeting, take your vote. But know that if you remove me from this company, you're not punishing poor judgment. You're punishing a woman for refusing to disappear into grief just because it makes you uncomfortable to see me move forward." The ballroom had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching, and Raymond knew this moment would be in every gossip site and newspaper by morning. Charles Sterling's face had gone red, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't quite believe what he'd just heard. "You ungrateful. My son gave you everything. Without him, you'd be nothing." Vivian's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Without me, your son would have bankrupted this company in 5 years. The only reason Sterling Properties survived his reckless expansion phase was because I was there to clean up his mistakes. I loved him, and I mourned him, and I'm still mourning him. But I will not spend the rest of my life being the tragic widow you can control." She turned to Raymond, her hand finding his. "I'm sorry. This wasn't what I wanted for tonight. But I'm done pretending, done performing, done trying to be whatever version of myself makes other people comfortable." Raymond squeezed her hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Then let's go." They left the gala together, Vivienne in her $1,000 gown and Raymond in his borrowed tuxedo, walking past reporters and cameras and shocked society figures. Isla was with them. Vivian had texted her assistant to bring her down from the children's area upstairs, and the little girl held both their hands as they pushed through the crowd. The cameras went crazy, flashes blinding, reporters shouting questions about the confrontation. But Raymond kept his eyes forward and his grip firm on Isla's hand. They made it to the car, and only once they were safely inside with the doors locked did Vivian let out a shaky breath. "I just committed career suicide," she said, her voice oddly calm. "By Monday afternoon, I'll probably be voted out of the company I built. My father-in-law will make sure of it." Raymond started the engine, pulling away from the hotel and its chaos. "Maybe. Or maybe the board will surprise you. Either way, you told the truth." That counts for something. Vivian leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. "I'm terrified. And relieved. And I have no idea what happens next." What happened next was both worse and better than anyone anticipated. The video of Vivian's speech went viral overnight, shared and reshared across social media, with hashtags about widow shaming and corporate sexism. By Sunday morning, there were think pieces in major newspapers about the impossible standards placed on grieving women, particularly women in leadership positions. Former employees came forward with stories about Vivian's brilliance and the ways she'd been undermined by her husband's family. Business analysts pointed out that the company's most successful quarters had all come under her sole leadership. By Monday morning, when the board meeting was supposed to happen, there were protesters outside Sterling Properties headquarters holding signs that read, "Support Vivian" and "Stop widow shaming." The board, apparently reading the room, issued a statement expressing their full confidence in Vivian's leadership and suggesting that the emergency meeting had been based on a misunderstanding. Charles Sterling, facing public backlash and questions about his own competence, quietly resigned from the board. The publicist called it a victory. Vivian called it exhausting. Raymond returned to his bakery to find it under siege, but in a good way, surprisingly. Apparently, standing beside Vivian during her moment of truth had made him into some kind of folk hero. Orders tripled overnight, with customers specifically requesting the baker who'd shown up at a society gala for love. The landlord who'd been worried about disruption suddenly decided the publicity was good for the building. Even the photographers eventually got bored and moved on to the next scandal. Through it all, Raymond kept his focus on the things that actually mattered. Bryn, who was slowly starting to open up about her fears and grief with the help of a new therapist. His bakery, which now employed 2 additional people to handle the increased demand. And Vivian, who was trying to figure out who she was allowed to be now that she'd stopped performing for everyone else. They took things slowly, mindful of the girls and the healing they were all still doing. Coffee dates became dinner dates, became weekend trips to the beach where they could be anonymous. Isla and Bryn became inseparable, the kind of friends who spoke in shorthand and shared secrets whispered under blankets during sleepovers. 6 months after the gala, Raymond closed his bakery early on a Wednesday afternoon and took Bryn to Vivian's house. They'd been talking about this moment for weeks, all 4 of them, sitting around Vivian's kitchen table like a makeshift family, trying to figure out what shape they wanted to take. Bryn had questions, lots of them, about what it would mean if Raymond and Vivian got more serious. Would they have to move? Would Bryn have to change schools? Would Vivian try to replace her mom? Raymond and Vivian had answered every question honestly, promising that any decisions would be made together, that nothing would change without everyone agreeing. Today was about making one of those decisions together. Vivian had suggested, tentatively, that maybe they could talk about actually dating officially, not hiding, not being careful, but actually building something real. Raymond had agreed, but only if Bryn was comfortable with it. His daughter came first. She always would. They sat in Vivian's living room, less formal than it had been 6 months ago, with photos on the walls now and toys scattered across the floor. Isla immediately dragged Bryn off to show her something urgent upstairs, leaving the adults alone. Vivian looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I know this is complicated," she started, but Raymond shook his head. "It's not complicated. Not the important parts anyway. I love you. I love who I am when I'm with you. I love watching Isla and Bryn be kids together. I love that you leave your shoes by the door and burn toast and sing off-key in the car. The complicated parts, the money, the company, the different worlds we come from, that's just logistics. We can figure out logistics. Vivian's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I love you too. I love that you wake up at 3 in the morning to make bread, and that you let Isla help even though she makes a mess. I love that you never treated me like I was fragile or needed fixing. I love that you see me, not the CEO or the widow or the woman in the articles, but just me. Raymond reached for her hand, and this time when he touched her, there was no hesitation, no pulling back. So we do this, officially, all of us together, figuring it out as we go. Vivian nodded, squeezing his fingers. All of us, together. Upstairs, they could hear the girls giggling about something, the sound of children who'd learned that it was possible to be happy again after loss. Raymond thought about the path that had led him here, the grief and the struggle, the coffee shop where a 6-year-old had appeared before her mother, the moment he'd decided to be brave instead of careful. It hadn't been easy. It still wasn't easy. But sitting in this living room with this woman who'd learned to take off her armor, listening to his daughter laugh with genuine joy, Raymond felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. He felt like maybe the future didn't have to be about survival. Maybe it could be about actually living again. A year after that first disastrous, perfect coffee shop meeting, Raymond and Vivian stood in the kitchen of a new house, not his cramped apartment, not her Georgian mansion, but something in between that they'd chosen together. It was a Sunday morning, and the house smelled like cinnamon rolls and coffee. Isla and Bryn were at the table, arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to pick the movie for that afternoon. Vivienne was attempting to flip pancakes with varying degrees of success, flour in her hair and on her nose. Raymond leaned against the counter, watching his chosen family move around each other with the comfortable chaos of people who knew they belonged together, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it made his chest ache. They'd lost so much, all of them. They'd been broken in ways that would never fully heal. But they'd found each other in the wreckage. And they'd built something new. Not perfect, not simple, but real and honest and worth fighting for. Vivian caught him staring and raised an eyebrow. What? Raymond shook his head, smiling. Just thinking about that night in the coffee shop. How terrified I was when Isla walked up to my table. Vivian abandoned the pancakes to come stand beside him, her shoulder pressing against his. I was terrified too. Sending her in first seemed like a good idea at the time. Let her scope things out, see if you seemed safe. In retrospect, it was probably the worst first impression possible. Raymond laughed. It was perfect. She told me you'd be late, that you said I'd wait. She was right. I would have waited all night. Isla looked up from the table, grinning. I told you it was fate. The universe wanted you to meet. Bryn rolled her eyes with the exaggerated patience of a 9-year-old dealing with younger children. That's not how the universe works, Isla. But she was smiling too, and Raymond saw how her hand reached across the table to link fingers with Isla's, the way his daughter had learned to hold on to the people she loved instead of pushing them away. The pancakes burned while they stood there, lost in the moment, but nobody minded. They ordered pizza instead and ate it on the living room floor while the girls debated movie choices. Later, after the movie ended and the girls had fallen asleep in a nest of blankets and pillows, Raymond and Vivian sat on the back porch watching the stars come out. Do you ever regret it? Vivian asked quietly. Taking a chance on the woman whose daughter showed up before she did? Raymond considered the question seriously. He thought about the photographers and the articles, the stress and the scrutiny. He thought about the difficult conversations with Bryn and the compromises they'd all had to make. But then he thought about this porch, this house, this life they'd built from the pieces of their broken hearts. He thought about Isla's laugh and Bryn's slow healing, about morning coffee and midnight conversations, about learning to love again when he'd thought that part of his life was over. "Not for a second," he said, pulling Vivian closer. "Not for a single second." She rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence while the night settled around them. Inside, through the window, they could see Isla and Bryn still asleep, best friends and almost sisters, children who'd learned that families could be built as well as born. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There were always challenges. But tonight, in this moment, Raymond felt something he'd never thought he'd feel again after his wife died. He felt complete. Not because Vivian had filled a hole or fixed what was broken, but because they'd both been brave enough to show up as they really were, scared and flawed and carrying grief, and chosen to build something new together anyway. That, Raymond thought, was worth every difficult moment. That was worth everything.